Exley has pastored and done a phenomenal job pastoring churches. Yesterday we shared stories and I gleaned from him his wisdom in pastoring. He's pastored at different places in the nation. He's also a prolific writer. You might have seen the books in the lobby when you came in, and he will be talking about those in just a minute, but he is an awesome, powerful writer, author of many books. He's a wonderful preacher, and I'm telling you, he has spent lots and lots. I would say that he is an expert on the topic of marriage. He's spent not only time teaching, but all the time that it takes to dig and prepare and speak to couples about that. I would say that the thing that makes you an expert is that Dr. Exley has walked it for 50 years now. And I want to learn from somebody like that. So Dr. Exley, would you come this morning? Church, won't you one more time make him welcome? It's so good to have you. Thank you, buddy. Love you so much. Love you. It's good to have you.
Good morning, church. Good morning. Wow, was worship incredible or what? And I said, what an anointed worship. Now, I don't want to spend any more time doing that. We got to fly. Malachi, chapter number 2. The prophet Malachi, chapter number 2. I'm going to be reading from the Message Bible this morning. Malachi, chapter number 2, verses 14 through 16. God was there as a witness when you spoke your marriage vows to your young bride. And now you've broken those vows. Broken the faith bond with your vowed companion, your covenant wife. God, not you, made marriage. His Spirit inhabits even the smallest details of marriage. And what does He want from marriage? Children of God. That's what. So guard the spirit of marriage within you. Don't cheat on your spouse. I hate divorce, says the God of Israel. God of the angels' army says, I hate the violent dismembering of the one flesh of marriage. So watch yourselves. Don't let your guard down. Don't cheat. During the closing months of World War II, the man who was to become my father began exchanging letters with a beautiful but timid 18-year-old girl named Irene. They could have hardly been less alike. She was a true innocent, having never traveled more than 10 miles from her birthplace in rural northeastern Colorado. My father, or the man who was to become my father, was a Navy man, having spent much of World War II stationed in Hawaii. As the war was winding down in September of 1945, he was transferred to the naval base in Corpus Christi, Texas, and given a 2-week furlough. He hitchhiked to Colorado to see if that girl he had been exchanging letters with was as pretty as her picture. Not surprisingly, it was love at first sight, and after a whirlwind courtship, they were married. On November 7th, 1945, for nearly 61 years, well, not nearly, for 61 years, 3 months, and 1 day, they remained completely devoted to one another. A devotion that seems all the more remarkable given the social culture in which we now live with its throwaway relationships. When it became impossible for my father to eat or to leave his bed, during the last days of his life, my mother spent all day sitting on the bed or laying on the bed beside my father. My siblings and I were there. We urged Mother to take some rest, take care of herself. We'll be here with Daddy. You don't have to stay here the whole time. We'll never let him be alone. And she looked at us and said, when I married your father, I promised that I would never leave him nor forsake him, and I'm not leaving him now. Daddy couldn't eat. So what little food Mother took, she took, lying on the bed beside him. And that's where she was when my father took his last breath and went home to be with Jesus. I can't help but marvel at the love they shared. And I remember following their 50th wedding anniversary, after the festivity of events, all of us children gathered back home at Mom and Dad's house, and we were in the living room reminiscing. Mom and Dad were sitting on the couch, and my 9-year-old niece was sitting beside my mother, snuggled up against her, and when there was a pause in the conversation, she looked at my mother and said, "Grandma, how does anyone stay married for 50 years?" Now, her question was raw with the pain of her parents' recent divorce. And there was a strange silence as we all sat there wondering what my mother was going to say. How are we going to handle this? And after a moment, my mother put her arm around her 9-year-old granddaughter and said to her, "Sweetheart, I don't know how anyone else stays married 50 years, but your grandfather and I were able to stay married 50 years because we could always talk about everything." That's one of the secrets, isn't it? Communication. The ability to talk about everything, not just easy things, but some hard things. Now, my mom and dad had a good marriage, but it wasn't an easy marriage. During their 61 years, they had some tough things to talk about. The kind of things that would have done a lesser marriage in. Things like financial pressure. Shortly after they were married, my father decided to go into the water well business. He was undercapitalized. His equipment was old and in poor repair and continued to break down. Finally, the thing that did him in was a work-related injury, and without workers' compensation or insurance, the business failed. Mother and Dad spent the next several years digging out of debt because my father refused to file bankruptcy. He felt if you made a debt, you were responsible to pay it. Now, I don't know what things Mom and Dad said during those days because I would be far too young to remember. But I think it's safe for us to assume that my mother did not belittle my father, though she may have been tempted to. I mean, she may have been tempted to say something to him like this: "Why did you think you had to go into business for yourself? What did you know about drilling water wells? You knew you were undercapitalized. The equipment was old, would break down. This was foolish. Why did you put us in this predicament? Why couldn't you just take a job like an ordinary man? Look at the mess we've made." Now, I know they didn't have that conversation because those are the kind of conversations that sorely wound a marriage. They had other tough things to talk about as well. Maybe the toughest thing they had to talk about was that just weeks after their 10th anniversary, Mother gave birth to her 4th child, our long-awaited baby sister. There've been us 3 boys. I'm the oldest, 2 brothers. And then finally, Mother gave birth to a baby girl. I remember when my grandmother told us, you have a baby sister. I remember I'm running through the neighborhood. I'm 10 years old. I'm running through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, saying, we have a baby sister, we have a baby sister. My father came home an hour or 2 later. And the moment I saw him, I knew something was terribly wrong. His face was a suffering mask. His shoulders were bowed with grief. He gathered us 3 boys in the living room. And he told us, you have a baby sister, but she was born hydrocephalic. At birth, her head is larger than the rest of her body. And she probably won't live very long. And if she does, she'll never be normal. That's all I could take. I remember bursting off the couch, running through the kitchen, out the back door, into the detached garage, throwing myself face down on the dirt floor, pounding my fist into the ground, weeping. Our sister lived 3 months. And I have poignant memories of those 3 months. I remember Mother setting me in a big green armchair in the living room and placing Carolyn in my arms, carefully arranging her huge head on the armchair, and then watching with a painful love while I fed her a few pitiful ounces from a bottle. I remember Dad gathering Mom and us boys around the little crib night after night and praying and asking God for healing. I remember Mother bathing Carolyn carefully on the kitchen counter. And then after bathing her, taking a cloth tape measure, the kind that women use for sewing, and very carefully measuring Carolyn's head to see if maybe there was a gradual miracle taking place. There wasn't. Then my mother would pick up that tragically deformed child, hold her close to her heart, with tears running down her cheeks. Carolyn died on a gray December day. When a child dies, it often sounds a death knell for a marriage. Not so in my parents' case. Though they grieved unspeakably. And to just give you an idea how unspeakable that grief was, more than 50 years later, when my father's sister died, I was with my dad when he received the news, and the first thing my father said was this: Alcee gets to see Carolyn before I do. More than 50 years later. And he's still longing to see the baby girl he lost. After my father died, my mother grieved unspeakably. She was visiting us, and we were sitting on the porch overlooking the lake. Mother was saying, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can make it. I don't think I can live without your father. And in an attempt to comfort her, I said to her, well, how did you make it when Carolyn died? And she said, when Carolyn died, I had your father. When I needed to talk, he listened to me. And when I couldn't talk, he held me. Mom and Dad had some tough things to talk about. But instead of separating them, those difficult, challenging life experiences drew them together and drew them to God. It wasn't the end of the tough times. Shortly thereafter, Mother became pregnant again, and then she lost her hearing. At 30 years of age, my mother was virtually stone deaf. She could hear somewhat, with the strongest hearing aids possible, and she learned to read lips. And then shortly after that, my father was seriously injured in an oil field accident that made it impossible for him to continue to work in the oil fields. Baker Oil Tools came to him and said, "Dick, we're going to terminate you, or you can transfer to Houston, Texas, and work in the home office." Well, that would seem to be a no-brainer, but it was complicated by this. My mother was an adopted child, adopted by a middle-aged couple. And she had promised her parents that she would care for them. My grandfather, her father was already deceased, but my grandmother was still living. She was crippled by arthritis and had to walk on 2 crutches. Her parents sent her to work in a sawmill when she was 6 years old. She never learned to read and write. She couldn't even sign her own name. She couldn't drive. How does my mother move 1,300 miles away and leave her mother in that condition? My father said to her, "Alice, sell your little house and come to Texas with us." And my grandmother looked at him and said, "Dick, no house is big enough for 2 women." And she said to my mother, "Your place is with your husband. Go to Texas. Jesus will take care of me." I'll never forget the cold December day when we told her goodbye. She was leaning on her 2 aluminum crutches. As mother and 4 children, I was the oldest, 12 years old. My baby sister barely a year old. And my dad so crippled that we had to make a bed in the back seat of that big 1955 Buick because the pain was too great for him to sit up. I can't imagine what Mom and Dad talked about those nights as they faced an uncertain future. Mom and Dad were deeply in love. A love that I admired, and if you'll forgive me, envied. Mom and Dad could always talk about everything. But in the last years of the marriage, my father had a severe case of fibrosis in his lungs, made it very difficult for him to breathe, nearly impossible for him to speak. And my mother was more and more deaf. And so Mom and Dad, who could always talk about everything, couldn't talk about things anymore. My father could only speak in a voice like this. And of course, my mother couldn't hear. So they gave up talking for touching. My dad spent a lot of the last years of his life sitting in a recliner chair, playing computer games or reading books. And every time Mom walked by his chair, she'd reach down and pat him on the shoulder or run his fingers through her hair, and Daddy would reach up for a hand, and if he thought no one was watching, he'd pat her on the butt. Grandma, how does anyone stay married 50 years? Well, she told my granddaughter that they could always talk about everything. But after my daddy died, she told me 2 other things. She said we were married on a Thursday in a small wedding in the Assemblies of God Church in Sterling, Colorado. Then we went to Aunt Elsie's house for a wedding brunch, and then we boarded the Continental Trailways bus to Denver, Colorado on the first leg of our journey to Craig, where we were going to spend our honeymoon. We arrived in Denver, Colorado just in time to walk and carry our suitcases to a small motel, change our clothes, and go to church. And I thought, who goes to church on their wedding night? You say that was legalistic. No, Mother and Dad did not have a legalistic bone in their body. What Mother and Dad had was a passionate love for Jesus Christ and an understanding that if their marriage was going to withstand the difficulties that were coming, it was going to have to be built on something stronger than a romantic attraction to each other. That only faith in Jesus Christ and His abiding presence in their life could sustain them in the days and years ahead. And then sitting on the porch, after she told me she had Daddy after Carolyn died, then she said, "Can I tell you something we've never told anyone?" I said, "Sure, Mom." She said, "I was a true innocent when we married. My adopted parents didn't ever tell me anything about the way of a man and a woman after they were married. I know you'll find this hard to believe, but I didn't have any idea how babies were made." And said, "When I realized what your father wanted to do when we were married, I was aghast. Just terrified." And she said, "Richard, we didn't consummate our marriage for more than a month." And then she said this, "That's when I knew that your father loved me more than he loved himself." And that's what I want to tell you. How does anyone stay married 50 years? They got Jesus at the center of their marriage. How does anyone stay married more than 50? They love each other more than they love themselves. How does anybody stay married 50 years? They could always talk about everything. Now, Brenda and I will celebrate our 50th anniversary on June 10th. When we've been married 61 years, I want to have the kind of marriage my mom and daddy had. But it won't just happen. And if you have good sense, that's the kind of marriage you want to have too. But it won't just happen. It has to be founded on a shared faith in Jesus Christ. And your marriage has to be empowered by the Holy Spirit. We can't love each other the way we need to love each other without the anointing and abiding power of the Holy Spirit. And then we have to make a choice in all the big things and all the little things, day in and day out, to deliberately say, I am going to love my spouse more than I love myself. I'm going to put his or her needs ahead of my own. And finally, you have to be willing to talk about everything. To never allow hurts, disappointments, bitterness to build a wall between you. You've got to always deal with that stuff. Talk it through. Pronounce forgiveness. Express love. And you too can stay married for 50 years. Here's what I'd like to do this morning, and I'm very cognizant of the time, so we have to move quickly. I would like for every couple in the house to come as a couple and stand down front here before me. I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk to your spouse. Then I'm going to pray God's blessing, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to renew your commitment each to the other. If you're a couple, you're here, would you come very, very quickly? We don't have much time. Come quickly. When you get here, hold each other's hands, look each other in the eye, Hello, handsome, she said. I thought she was looking at me. No, she said, no, not looking at me. Boy, I walked into that, didn't I? It's just possible. Just possible. Step closer because there are people coming up behind you. It's just possible that there's some unresolved issues between the two of you today. There's some anger, some hurt, some disappointment. I call those things pieces of misplaced furniture in the soul of your relationship. And if you don't deal with them, every time you try to get close to each other, you bump into them. So right now, just a moment, I'm going to want you to talk to each other. If you need to make an apology, you've been too proud, says, no, I'm not going to apologize, and you haven't. That's a piece of misplaced furniture. This would be a good time for you to say, sweetheart, this is hard for me. You know what a proud man I am. You know what a stubborn woman I am. But sweetheart, I don't want there to be any misplaced furniture in our relationship. I was wrong. There's no excuse for what I did. Please forgive me. And with God's help, I'm going to be different. Or maybe the apology's already been made, but because you were hurt so deeply, so profoundly, you've hung on to that hurt. Listen to me, when you hang on to the hurt, what you're saying is, my hurt and my pain is more important to me than my marriage. So maybe you need to say, forgive me for not accepting your apology. I'm letting go of my hurt. I'm letting go of my disappointment, letting go of my bitterness. I'm forgiving you. I don't want anything in the soul of our marriage. You say, well, what if we don't have any unfinished business? Well, then just say sweet things to each other, for heaven's sake. Go ahead. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes right now. A couple of minutes right now.